Good afternoon, Mishpachah and Havarim, and all who join me here for the reading of this book. So, before we start, let's pitch this tent with Elohim. Let's bow our hearts. Beloved Abba Yahweh, we come before you to worship and praise you, and to thank you most humbly for all you are doing in our lives. Everything you're doing in our lives, Father, inside and out. Thank you for bringing us together to share your word from the Torah of YHWH. Please open up our eyes to see, our ears to hear, and our hearts to understand that which you will us to understand within these words. Please free us from the ties that secure us in mankind's ticked boxes, Father. And I pray, fill us full of your Ruach HaKodesh, and change our ways to your way. Through Yeshua in Yahweh, great in Kodashah, Yahweh Echad. Amen. Thank you. This is a section about health and cleanliness. So, I've left the glossary and the pronunciation guide in for your reference. Let's begin. The Torah of YHWH, Health and Cleanliness, Quarantine, Numbers, chapter 5, verse 2 to 3. Command the children of Israel to send out of the camp every leper, and everyone who has a discharge, and whoever becomes defiled for a being. Send out both male and female, send them outside the camp, so that they do not defile their camps, in the midst of which I dwell. See also Leviticus, chapter 13, verse 46, and Deuteronomy, chapter 23, verses 10 to 11, and chapter 24, verse 8. Skin infections. Leviticus, chapter 13, verses 2 to 28. They got Cohen written here, in brackets. When a man has on the skin of his body a swelling, a scab, or a bright spot, and it shall become on the skin of his body like a leprous infection, then he shall be brought to Aharon the Cohen, or to one of his sons the Kohanim, and the Cohen shall look at the infection of the skin of the body, and if the hair on the infection has turned white, and the infection appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a leprous infection. And the Cohen shall look at him and pronounce him unclean. But if the bright spot is white on the skin of his body, and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and its hair has turned white, then the Cohen shall shut up the infected one 7 days, and the Cohen shall look at him on the 7th day and see if the infection appears to be as it was, and the infection has not spread on the skin. Then the Cohen shall shut him up another 7 days, and the Cohen shall look at him again on the 7th day and see if the infection has darkened, and the infection has not spread on the skin. Then the Cohen shall pronounce him clean. It is a scab, and he shall wash his garments and be clean. But if the scab spreads further over the skin, after he has been seen by the Cohen for his cleansing, he shall be seen by the Cohen again, and the Cohen shall look and see. And if the scab has spread on his skin, then the Cohen shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy. When the infection of leprosy is on a man, then he shall be brought to me, to the Cohen. And the Cohen shall look and see. If the swelling on the skin is white, and it has turned the hair white, and there is a spot of raw flesh in the swelling, it is an old leprosy on the skin of his body, and the Cohen shall pronounce him unclean. He does not shut him up, for he is unclean. And if leprosy breaks out all over the skin, and the leprosy shall cover all the skin of the infected one, from his head to his foot. Wherever the Kohen looks, then the Kohen shall look and see. If the leprosy has covered all his body, he shall pronounce the infected one clean. It has all turned white, he is clean. But the day raw flesh appears on him, he is unclean. And the Kohen shall look at the raw flesh, and pronounce him to be unclean. The raw flesh is unclean, it is leprosy. Or when the raw flesh changes and turns white again, you shall come to the Kohen, and the Kohen shall look at him and see if the infection has turned white. Then the Kohen shall pronounce the infected one clean. He is clean. And when the body has a boil in the skin, and it is healed, and in the place of the boil there comes a white swelling or a bright spot, reddish white, then it shall be seen by the Kohen. And the Kohen shall look and see if it appears deeper than the skin, and its hair has turned white. The Kohen shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous infection which has broken out of the boil. But if the Kohen looks at it and sees no white hairs in it, and it is not deeper than the skin, but has faded, then the Kohen shall shut him up 7 days. And if it has spread further over the skin, then the Kohen shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous infection. But if the bright spot stays in its place, it has not spread. It is the scar of the boil, and the Kohen shall pronounce him clean. Or when the body receives a burn on its skin by fire, and the raw flesh of the burn shall become a bright spot, reddish white or white, then the Kohen shall look at it and see if the hair of the bright spot has turned white, and it appears deeper than the skin. It is leprosy broken out of the burn, in the burn. And the Kohen shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous infection. But if the Kohen looks at it and sees there are no white hairs in the bright spot, and it is not deeper than the skin, but has faded, then the Kohen shall shut him up 7 days. And the Kohen shall look at him on the 7th day. If it spreads further over the skin, then the Kohen shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous infection. But if the bright spot stays in its place, and has not spread on the skin, but has faded, it is a swelling from the burn. And the Kohen shall pronounce him clean, for it is the scar from the burn. See also Deuteronomy, chapter 24, verse 8. Now, infection of the head or beard, Leviticus, chapter 13, verse 29 to 46. When a man or a woman has an infection on the head or in the beard, then the Kohen shall look at the infection and see if it appears deeper than the skin, and there is thin yellow hair in it, then the Kohen shall pronounce him unclean. It is an eruption, a leprosy of the beard, of the head or beard. But when the Kohen looks at the infection of the eruption and sees that it does not appear deeper than the skin, and there is no black hair in it, then the Kohen shall shut up the infection of the eruption 7 days. And on the 7th day the Kohen shall look at the infection and see if the eruption has not spread, and there is no yellow hair in it, and the eruption does not appear deeper than the skin, then he shall shave himself, but the eruption he does not shave. And the Kohen shall shut up the eruption another 7 days. And on the 7th day the Kohen shall look at the eruption and see If the eruption has not spread over the skin, and does not appear deeper than the skin, then the Kohen shall pronounce him clean, and he shall wash his garments, and he shall be clean. But if the eruption spreads further over the skin after his cleansing, then the Kohen shall look at him and see if the eruption has spread over the skin. The Kohen need not seek for yellow hair, he is unclean. But if the eruption appears to have stayed, and there is black hair grown up in it, the eruption has healed. He is clean, and the Kohen shall pronounce him clean. And when a man or a woman has bright spots on the skin of the body, white bright spots, then the Kohen shall look and see if the bright spots on the skin of the body are dull white. It is a white spot that grows on the skin. He is clean. And when a man loses the hair of his head, he is bald, he is clean. And if the hair has fallen from his forehead, he is bald on the forehead, he is clean. And when there is on the bald head or bald forehead a reddish white infection, it is leprosy breaking out on his bald head or his bald forehead. And the Kohen shall look at it and see. If the swelling of the infection is reddish white on his bald head or on his bald forehead, as the appearance of leprosy on the skin of the body, he is a leprous man, he is unclean. The Kohen shall pronounce him unclean without fail, his infection is on his head. As for the leper who has the infection, his garments are torn, and his head is uncovered, and he has to cover his upper lip and cry, "Unclean, unclean, he is unclean. All the days he has the infection, he is unclean. He is unclean, and he dwells alone. His dwelling place is outside the camp." See also Deuteronomy 24:8. A garment or object with an infection. Leviticus chapter 13 verses 47 to 59. When a garment has an infection of leprosy in it, a woolen garment, or in a linen garment, or in the warp, or in the weft of linen or wool, the little pieces, the creases, or in the leather, or in any leather work, and the infection shall be greenish or reddish in the garment, or in the leather, or in the warp, or in the weft, or in any leather object, it is an infection of leprosy, and shall be shown to the Kohen. And the Kohen shall look at the infection and shut up the infection 7 days. And he shall look at the infection on the 7th day. And when the infection has spread in the garment, or in the warp, or in the weft, or in the leather, or any leather work, the infection is an active leprosy, it is unclean. And he shall burn that garment, or the warp, or the weft, in wool, or in linen, or in any leather object in which the infection is, for it is an active leprosy, it is burned with fire. But if the Kohen looks and sees the infection has not spread in the garment, or in the warp, or in the weft, or in any leather object, then the Kohen shall give command, and they shall wash that in which the infection is, and he shall shut it up another 7 days, and the Kohen shall look at the infection after it has been washed and see. If the infection has not changed its appearance, though the infection has not spread, it is unclean. And burn it in the fire, it is eaten away in its inside or outside. And if the Kohen shall look and see that the infection has faded after washing it, then he shall tear it out of the garment, or out of the warp, or out of the weft, or out of the leather. And if it is still seen in the garment, or in the warp, or in the weft, or in the leather object, it is a spreading infection. Burn it with fire, that in which the infection is. And if you wash the garment, or the warp, or the weft, or any leather object, if the infection has disappeared from it, then it shall be washed a second time, and shall be clean. This is the Torah of the infection of leprosy in a garment of wool or linen, or in the warp, or in the weft, or in any leather object, to pronounce it clean, or to pronounce it unclean. Cleansing of a leper, Leviticus chapter 14 verses 2 to 9. This shall be the Torah of the leper for the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought to the Cohen, and the Cohen shall go out of the camp, and the Cohen shall look and see if the leprosy is healed in the leper. Then the Cohen shall command, and he shall take for him who is to be cleansed 2 live and clean birds, and cedar wood, and scarlet, and hyssop. And the Cohen shall command, and he shall kill one of the birds in an earthen vessel over running water. Let him take the live bird, and the cedar wood, and the scarlet, and the hyssop, and dip them and the live bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the running water, and he shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed from the leprosy, and shall pronounce him clean, and shall let the live bird loose in the open field. And he who is to be cleansed shall wash his garments, and shall shave off all his hair, and wash himself in water, and shall be clean. Then after that he comes into the camp, but shall stay outside his tent 7 days, and on the 7th day it shall be that he shaves all the hair off his head, and his beard, and his eyebrows, even all his hair he shaves off. And he shall wash his garments, and wash his body in water, and shall be clean. See also Leviticus chapter 14 verses 10 to 33. A house with an infection, Leviticus chapter 14 verses 34 to 48. When you come into the land of Canaan, which I am giving you as a possession, and I put a plague of leprosy in a house in the land of your possession, then shall the one who owns the house come and inform the Cohen, saying, It seems to me that there is some plague in the house. And the Cohen shall command, and they shall empty the house before the Cohen goes in to look at the plague, so that all that is in the house is not made unclean. And after that the Cohen goes in to look at the house, and he shall look at the plague, and see if the plague is on the walls of the house, with sunken places, greenish or reddish, which appear to be deep in the wall. Then the Cohen shall go out of the house to the door of the house, and shut up the house 7 days. And the Cohen shall come again on the 7th day, and look and see if the plague has spread on the walls of the house. When the Cohen shall command, and they shall remove the stones with the plague of them in them, and they shall throw them outside the city into an unclean place, while he lets the house be scraped inside all around. Wow. And the dust that they scrape off, they shall pour out in an unclean place outside the city. And they shall take other stones and put them in the place of those stones, and take other mortar and plaster the house. Make it all fresh. And if the plague comes back and breaks out in the house after he has removed the stones, after he has scraped the house, and after it is plastered, then the Cohen shall come and look and see, and if the plague has spread in the house, it is an active leprosy in the house, it is unclean. And he shall break down the house, its stones, and its timber, and all the plaster of the house, and he shall bring them outside the city to an unclean place. And he who goes into the house all the days while it is shut up becomes unclean until evening. And he who lies down in the house has to wash his garments, and he who eats in the house has to wash his garments. However, if the Cohen indeed comes in and looks at it and sees that the plague has not spread in the house after the house was plastered, then the Cohen shall pronounce the house clean, because the plague is healed. See also Leviticus chapter 14, verses 49 to 53. I'm just thinking you could lose your house because your house got the plague. Wow. Anyway, a discharge. Leviticus chapter 15, verse 2 to 13. When any man has a discharge from his flesh, his discharge is unclean, and this is his uncleanness in regard to his discharge. Whether his flesh runs with his discharge, or his flesh is stopped up by his discharge, it is his uncleanness. Any bed becomes unclean on which he who has the discharge lies, and any object on which he sits becomes unclean, and anyone who touches his bed has to wash his garments, and shall bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. And he who sits on any object on which he who has the discharge sat has to wash his garments, and shall bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. And he who touches the flesh of him who has the discharge has to wash his garments, and shall bathe in water, and shall be unclean until evening. And when he who has the discharge spits on him who is clean, then he shall wash his garments, and shall bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. Any sandal on which he who has the discharge rides becomes unclean. Saddle, not sandal. Any saddle on which he who has the discharge rides becomes unclean. And whoever touches any of that which was under him is unclean until evening, and he who is carrying them up has to wash his garments, and shall bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. And anyone whom he who has the discharge touches without rinsing his hands in water shall wash his garment and bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. And the earthenware vessel, he who has the discharge touches has to be broken, and every wooden vessel has to be rinsed in water. And when he who has a discharge is cleansed of his discharge, then he shall count for himself 7 days in his cleansing, and shall wash his garments, and shall bathe his flesh in running water, and be clean. See also Leviticus chapter 15 verses 14 to 15, and Leviticus chapter 22 verse 4. Emission of semen. Leviticus chapter 15 verse 16 to 18. When a man has an emission of semen, then he shall wash all his flesh in water, and be unclean until evening. And any garment and any leather on which there is semen shall also be washed with water. and be unclean until evening. And when a woman lies with a man, and there is an emission of semen, they both shall bathe in water and be unclean until evening. See also Leviticus chapter 22 verse 4 and Deuteronomy chapter 23 verse 10 and 11. Discharge of blood, Leviticus chapter 15 verses 19 to 29. When a woman has a discharge and the discharge from her flesh is blood, she has to be in her separation for 7 days. And whoever touches her is unclean until evening. And whatever she lies on during her separation is unclean. And whatever she sits on is unclean. And anyone who touches her bed has to wash his garments, and shall bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. And whoever touches any object that she sat on has to wash his garments, and shall bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. And if it is on the bed or on any object on which she sits when he touches it, he is unclean until evening. And if any man lies with her at all, and her monthly flow is on him, he shall be unclean 7 days. And any bed he lies on is unclean. And when a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, other than at the time of her monthly separation, or when she discharges beyond her usual time of monthly separation, all the days of her unclean discharge shall be as the days of her monthly separation. She is unclean. Any bed on which she lies all the days of her discharge is to her as the bed of her monthly separation, and whatever she sits on is unclean, as the uncleanness of her monthly separation. And anyone who touches them is unclean, and shall wash his garments, and shall bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. But if she is cleansed of her discharge, then she shall count for herself 7 days, and after that she is clean. See also Leviticus chapter 12 verse 2, and Leviticus chapter 15 verse 29 to 30, and chapter 20 verse 18. Okay, a carcass. Chapter 11 verses 39 and 40. And when any of the beasts which are yours for food dies, he who touches its carcass becomes unclean until evening, and he who eats of its carcass has to wash his garments, and shall be unclean until evening. And he who picks up its carcass has to wash his garments, and shall be unclean until evening. See also Exodus chapter 20 verse 31, Leviticus chapter 17 verse 15 and 16, and Deuteronomy chapter 14 verse 21. Contact with a corpse. Numbers chapter 11 verses 11 to 13. He who touches the dead of any human being is unclean for 7 days. He is to cleanse himself with the water on the 3rd day, and on the 7th day he is clean. But if he does not cleanse himself on the 3rd day, then on the 7th day he is not clean. Anyone who touches the dead of a human being and does not cleanse himself defiles the Mishkan of Yahweh. And that being shall be cut off from Yisrael. He is unclean, for the water for uncleanness was not sprinkled on him. His uncleanness is still upon him. Death in a dwelling. Numbers chapter 19 verses 14 and 15. This is the Torah. When a man dies in a tent, all who come, or a tent in these days, that's like the dwelling place we live in, all who come into the tent, into the dwelling place, and all who are in the tent are unclean for 7 days, and every open vessel which has no cover fastened on it is unclean. outdoors. Numbers chapter 19 verse 16. Anyone in the open field who touches someone slain by a sword, or who has died, or a bone of a man, or a grave, is unclean for 7 days. Okay, so cleansing. Numbers chapter 19 verses 17 to 22. And for the unclean being, they shall take some of the ashes of the heifer, burnt for cleansing from sin. See Numbers chapter 19 verses 2 to 10. And running water shall be put on them in a vessel, and a clean man shall take hyssop and dip it in the water, and shall sprinkle it on the tent, and on the vessels, and on the beings who were there, or on the one who touched a bone, or the slain, or the dead, or a grave. And the clean one shall sprinkle the unclean on the 3rd day, and on the 7th day. And on the 7th day he shall cleanse himself, and shall wash his garments, and bathe in water, and shall be clean in the evening. But the man who is unclean, and does not cleanse himself, that being shall be cut off from among the assembly, because he has defiled the Mikdash of YHWH. Water for uncleanness has not been sprinkled on him, he is unclean, and it shall be a law for them forever. And the one who sprinkles the water for uncleanness washes his garments, and the one who touches the water for uncleanness is unclean until evening. And whatever the unclean being touches is unclean, and the being who touches it is unclean until evening. See also Numbers chapter 31 verse 19. Excrement, the last bit. Deuteronomy chapter 23 verses 12 to 14. You shall have a place outside the camp where you shall go out, and you shall have a sharp implement among your equipment. And when you sit down outside, you shall dig with it, and turn and cover your excrement. For Yahweh your Elohim walks in the midst of your camp, to deliver you and your enemies over to you. Therefore your camp shall be Kodesh, so that he does not see unclean matter among you. You shall turn away from you. Wow. Well, that was jolly interesting. Next we'll be reading In the Land. These sections are not short. So I want to thank you all for joining us here, and I hope that's been a better heart to you. And I hope you've learnt from it, and I hope it's new to you, because it's all new to me. Very interesting how they used to live. And, life is so different these days. Anyway, I do hope and pray that you're all getting it. And thank you for joining us here to share in Abba's loving and caring guidelines. And thank you for everything, Father. And many berachoth and much ahav to you all for wanting to know about all this. May you have everything you need to be whole and complete. Shalom. And see you here or there sooner or later. Take care. Yirei Yahweh.